phones are switched off and other devices that are switched to silent. Just with regards to your tablet, if you could just press function and F8. Could also just remind members to declare any interest, financial or otherwise, as we move through today's business. So far, with regards to apologies, we've received an apology from Ms McLaughlin and from Mr Kinahan. Are members aware of any other apologies at this stage? Okay, thank you. Moving then to chairperson's business, there was an informal meeting with the independent panel who are reviewing on behalf of the Dáil Minister the initial teacher education infrastructure. Last week the Deputy Chair met with that group over lunch. Unfortunately he's not here to give some feedback. Peter, were you present at that meeting?
Yes, Chair, and I think as it indicated in members in a note about this previously, as the Chair rightly said, the thrust of the review is actually about teacher infrastructure, which is the Dáil matter, but the report itself, which has been published just before the summer, made a number of recommendations which fall into the DE sort of bailiwick around things like the curriculum, shared education being mandatory, the idea of the PTC becoming a 2-year Masters, and the 3-year BEd becoming a 4-year BEd, and also their thrust was also around things about schools becoming more involved in research, and indeed the initial teacher education institutes themselves becoming much more involved in research. It was very interesting, and they just took us over that. Okay,
so if members are content with me, just as a follow-up on that we do write to the colleges, maybe seeking further information on employment levels of graduates and also the number of graduates who are actively employed and learning. I'm not sure whether or not maybe we need to put a time scale for that within maybe 5 years of teaching, rather than leaving it very open. Are the members content that we do that, just to follow up? Thank you. Great. Moving then to the draft minutes of the meeting of the 24th of September, and they're at page 6 of your pack, and if you're content that they reflect that meeting, if you're happy enough, we'll agree that.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Matters arising, just refer you to Sky Drive ProLink. We're getting very technical on this committee, but this includes further submissions to our shared and integrated education inquiry, and if you're happy enough, then that material then can be published on our committee website. I think there had been agreement in the past that as we received information such as that it would be shared, so if you're happy enough we do that. Okay, thank you. The clerk will provide a summary paper on all evidence received after the closing date, which is the 24th of October. Okay. So moving on then to our correspondence, please refer you to pages 15 to 34, and we have 6 items provided under correspondence. Just draw your attention to correspondence from Carrickfergus College, and that's at page 19. The principal has requested a publicity event where members of the committee can meet then their top achieving pupils at GCSE and GCE level in his schools. I understand members met with this group last year. They've done extremely well. So if you're content, then I'm more than happy to meet with the group, and if any other members wish to do that as well, but we'll arrange that with the school and let people know, but I'm more than happy to meet with them. Okay. Refer you also to correspondence from a parent who is making a complaint in respect of autism support for their child. There's obviously sensitivities around this, and we don't normally get involved in individual cases, but they have raised policy issues just in respect of the complaints procedure and provision. So if you're content that we perhaps write to DE outlining the issue and trying to get some guidance from them as to how the parent can then proceed with regards to their complaint, if you're happy enough that we do that and work along those lines. This is a sensitive one. Mr Hazard.
Just on that, very often parents come to us with a grievance in any aspect of education. Is there a source where parents are guided to help them seek what is the best route possible that exists out there that they're able to go to? Because very often they, be it autism, be it no matter what it is, they don't. Now, I don't want to get us out of a job as such, but they don't know where to turn basically, and it can be very confusing for them. I just wonder, does a resource exist? Is it something maybe the committee could look at?
That might be interesting for us to look at. I know certainly in health there are various avenues that you can do that with, but I suppose very often it does come down to individual members being approached, and then we take up the individual's case. But I might want to look at that as an avenue. Any other members on this one? No? Okay. Moving then to correspondence on page 24 from DE, indicating that revised guidance on the publication of development proposals has been issued. There was a letter on the 25th of June 2014 from DE. This agreed to supply the committee with an embargo copy of this guidance prior to publication. Unfortunately, it hasn't happened in this case. It does appear to include no additional provision for the inclusion of the voice of the pupil in the development proposal process. And I believe that was something which the committee was keen to have included. And it also doesn't seem to appear to address the committee's concern in respect of timescales for consultation and transition periods, just with respect of composite proposals. Are members happy that we write to DE, maybe seeking a briefing on the revised guidance just as part of the area planning brief? It's due on the 8th of October, so that is actually quite a time, that's next week, so it might be quite tight for them to do that, but if we can advise, they should be able to include that in their paper, so if you're happy enough. Correspondence, page 29, is from SIA on its annual report and accounts. They've advised there is risk associated with its ICT support for computer-based assessment and A2C, which is the exam results communication software. SIA has also advised that its full budget was only agreed by the department on the 31st of July, obviously due to issues around June monitoring. You may wish to maybe consider some of that maybe during questioning to the department when they come up for October monitoring round. Would you like us maybe to? It might be useful maybe to correspond with the minister raising some of the concerns from the letter, and just to seek their consideration, his comments. Okay. Refer to the correspondence cover sheet at page 15. If you're content then that we dispose is probably the wrong word, but deal with the correspondence as per the cover sheet, yes. And also then refer you to table correspondence from the CAL committee inviting members to attend the China Day event, which is tomorrow. It coincides with our own event in the Long Gallery, but if members are in the building, you may like to attend both at some stage or another, if you can do that during the morning.
There's something, sorry, Chair, there's something going on out there today.
There is, it's just there's a musical event on and it's part of the National Day as well.
Okay,
so
but I got it wrong when I read tomorrow's event. I thought
there are two events going on,
very good.
Because tomorrow's officially the day. So. Okay. Members content? Any other issues you wish to raise? No? Moving then to the forward work programme. There's a copy of the draft at pages 36 to 38, and as I've referred, tomorrow we don't have a meeting. We have our STEM event with Sentinus, and it's running from 10:30 in the Long Gallery. And it allows mostly primary and post-primary pupils to display their science projects. And there'll also be opportunities for members to get photographs, so if nothing else, that may encourage you to be there. I would encourage you to attend tomorrow's event. We have a press release in the tabled items. So again, if you'd like to have a look at that, it's at page 5 of your tabled items. And if you're content, then we can publish that through the normal channels. Okay, thank you. There was to be a school visit that's now been cancelled. Would you like to?
Chair, it was simply NICE had actually contacted the clerk and suggested as part of the inquiry that they visit, that the committee visits Glen Craig Integrated Primary, and then subsequently phoned up and said no, that couldn't actually happen. So I think committee had also previously agreed that they did want to visit a number of schools and had identified a couple, so those will be arranged as previously agreed by the committee.
Okay. Members content with the programme as
Aye.
Mr Hazard?
Just on the schools, because I noticed the schools tomorrow, for example, I'm not sure how this works out. They're very much Belfast and Antrim, but more or less all of them, I think. How do we go about selecting schools? 'Cause I would love to get an analysis of schools in a rural community, how they share compared to the urban, and the different mix.
I think, Chair, the schools tomorrow, that's for a STEM event.
Yeah.
As it happens, some of them are from Lisburn, some from Larne. Yes, there's quite a few from Belfast. Sentinus actually made those arrangements for us.
Okay.
It's usually the case when we do a stakeholder event that we do invite.
That's why I was surprised.
all
There
over.
usually is a very good scope, and I was like,
But it was Sentinus did that
Okay.
bit, and these were the schools that had been involved in the Sentinus STEM programme. But I think members may feel a reasonable question what's going on in the more rural parts of the country in terms of STEM.
yeah, 'cause we get a very good insight to the likes of Fermanagh, for example, when we're down, and I think there's a lot to bring to life when you do look at the rural areas, especially if we're looking at the more sort of the mechanisms for sharing, the greater expense in travel and all that sort of stuff. So.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on to our next item, which is the ministerial briefing. I'm not sure whether they're here yet. No?
I'd like to take the reins.
Yes. If you're happy enough, we'll take a rees for a couple of minutes until the minister arrives.
Thanks. It looks strange for us sitting about talking about our holidays, and on TV. So if you just have a look to see if he's, it's not 1 o'clock yet, so he might be at the Chinese event.
It's tomorrow.
The Education Bill accelerated passage in our ministerial briefing. I refer members to the clerk's cover note at page 40 and a copy of the bill at page 68. And I think members need to be aware that this is to be treated confidentially, and refer you then to relevant correspondence from the Minister and other relevant correspondence included in their papers. We welcome the Minister and Fiona Hepper, Deputy Secretary, Paul Price, Director of ESA Delivery, and Mark Mawhinney, ESA Delivery Unit. You're all very welcome. Thank you for coming to committee, and after sitting on the Education Committee previously for 6 years and having seen 2 previous bills flounder, I see we've returned that we maybe are ready to go, and maybe third time lucky. So,
Yeah.
can I ask you to make your opening statement?
Thank you, Chair, and can I take this opportunity to congratulate you on your appointment as Chair of the Committee, and indeed congratulate the former Chair on his appointment as Minister for Social Development as well. I'm not sure if his presence at the executive meeting made a difference this time in terms of getting the bill to this stage, but we're certainly making progress and we hope to continue to do so. I'm appearing today to do 2 things: to give the committee a pre-introduction brief on the Education Bill and to explain my reasons for seeking accelerated passage for the bill in terms set down in Assembly Standing Orders. Firstly, I will provide a summary of the bill. The bill provides for the establishment of the Education Authority to replace the 5 education library boards and their staff commission. I believe that it's the most efficient and effective way of providing administrative arrangements for education which are compatible with new local government structures effective from the 1st of April 2015. The bill has 6 clauses and 4 schedules as follows. Clause 1 provides for the establishment of the Education Authority and applies Schedule 1, which puts in place arrangements for membership and governance of the authority, most of which are standard. Clause 2 provides that the functions of the Education Authority shall be transferred functions of the ELBs. Clause 3 dissolves the ELBs and their staff commission, and with Schedule 2 transfers their assets, liabilities and staff to the Education Authority. Clause 4, 5 and 6, with Schedules 3 and 4, cover the usual matters of amendments, repeals, interpretations and commencement. In only 2 respects does the bill provide some element of significant change. There are 2 areas where simply continuation was practically not an option. The first is the provision governing the chair and membership of the new authority. These differ from those that since 1986 have provided for ELB chairs and members, and which would not be suitably wieldy or precise when applied to a regional level authority, nor would they apply modern standards of governance. Of course, the bill retains the weighting effect of the provisions that have applied to balance of transfers trustee members within the ELB since 1986. It provides for 4 transfer and 3 trustee members. Otherwise, it provides for a compact total membership of 20, inclusive of 1 chair, 8 political members that are established by reference to party strengths in the Assembly, and 4 community appointments. The arrangements resemble the provisions agreed for ESA and agreed up-to-date model for the governance of regional level education administration. The second area where some change has been practically necessary is in the teacher appointment committees. These have operated in the 5 ELBs and have been directly involved in teaching appointments in controlled schools within their area. The new membership provision and the issues of scale that are presented by a regional organisation mean that these arrangements cannot continue. The bill provides that the new arrangements will be developed by the new authority in a teaching appointment scheme and will require the approval of DE. That is the extent of the bill. Despite the new nomenclature and the 2 necessary changes that I have summarised, the bill is best and most accurately understood as the minimal legislation required to create a single board in place of the 5 we currently have. Alongside the bill and the establishment of the Education Authority, I have agreed with the Executive that as part of the reorganisation of education administration, my department will fund a new organisation to provide support for controlled schools. The function of this body, as normally agreed by the Executive on the as formally agreed by the Executive on the 9th of September 2014, are within the briefing materials provided. As also agreed with the Executive, I have instructed my officials to explore a more robust underpinning to my commitment to fund a sectoral body for controlled schools. Turning finally to accelerated passage, Standing Order 42, paragraph 3 requires that I explain to the committee the reason or reasons for accelerated passage, the consequences of accelerated passage not being granted, and, if appropriate, any steps I have taken to minimise the future use of the accelerated passage procedure. The reason why accelerated passage is needed for this bill is that the Executive and the Assembly and I should do all possible to avoid the risk of not having an education authority in place by the 1st of April 2015. Accelerated passage enables the measures necessary to establish the governance of the authority to begin at a point where the 1st of April deadline remains feasible. Accelerated passage makes it possible to complete the legislation sufficiently in advance of the 1st of April for there then to be time enough for my department to apply the bill's schemes of transfer to the transfers from the ELBs to the new authority of approximately 35,000 staff. Accelerated passage makes it possible for my department to deliver for the 1st of April 2015 not just the legislation but the administrative minimum that is also required to establish the new authority. Madam Chair, the consequences of accelerated passage not being granted to this bill, therefore, will be that it will then be impossible for the Education Authority to be in place on the 1st of April 2015. The highly negative default in this event will be the unintended continuation of our 5 ELBs amidst new local government structures. Where this scenario continues, the legal basis both for our education and library boards' responsibilities and their governance arrangements will be significantly less secure than ever intended. The consequences of accelerated passage not being granted to this bill is a scenario of many significant risks. I believe these risks significantly outweigh the potential for accelerated passage to have any negative consequences, given the transparent straightforwardness of the bill that contains 6 clauses. In terms of steps I have taken to minimise the future use of the accelerated passage procedure, the committee will appreciate this instance does not establish nor intend any precedent in bringing forward future education legislation. It is a measure for the unique demands of the present situation, the very tight timeframe imposed upon us by the local government reform. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Minister, could you perhaps outline the timeline from first reading to the establishment and operation of the new body?
Well, if we follow through from today, we hope to have a reading within the Assembly by the 6th of October. Then, depending on whether or not the Assembly agrees to accelerated passage, I will be bringing a proposal to the Assembly on the 14th of October for that. If it's agreed, we will move towards the 21st of October with a consideration stage, with final consideration stage in around the 10th, 11th of November, with final stage on the 17th of November, and then Royal Assent at the stage afterwards.
Okay, thank you. Now, given the fact that you have said that this is a transparent and straightforward bill, and it's a relatively short bill by comparison to the bills that we've previously looked at, why would not allowing the committee it's a lot of time to scrutinise it be a real problem, given the fact that it could be done in a quite short period of time?
Madam Chair, we have to appoint the board in terms of advertising and appointing the board. We also have a legislative framework for that board to work under. So I would be deeply concerned that if there is delay to the bill and we move beyond the November-December period, by the time we move through the normal procedures of the House, the normal procedures of the committee, we could be into February-March time. I am hoping to have a legislative basis to establish this board, have a board in place, and have confidence within the system for the 1st of April. So our time frames are extremely tight as we move forward. And I think we also have to give confidence to the education sector, to the education board, and indeed the entire education family, that this bill is going to move forward and in place by the 1st of April.
Okay. It's apparent from the bill that the power to appoint the first Chief Executive rests with you as a Minister. What are the reasons for this, rather than going through the traditional method of a board appointing the first Chief Executive? Well,
timescales in relation to the establishment of the board, etc. I haven't any. I've been more concentrated on this stage of getting the legislation drawn together and moving towards establishment and getting the legislative framework in place, than focusing on who will be Chief Executive or how the appointment process will be set out in terms of directors or any of those matters. But it is a very tight time scale to work to. I think that in terms of a Minister appointing the first Chief Executive for a set time period and then the board moving towards an appointment is a preferable way forward.
Okay, so you're looking at sort of an interim process where it's an interim Chief Executive?
It's certainly an option I'm looking at, yes.
Okay, and obviously can we be assured that it will be an open and transparent process?
I will have to follow public appointments procedures.
With regards to the interim appointment as well? Okay, obviously we would appreciate that, and that would give some comfort. You have mentioned the controlled sector body. How do you envisage making this robust with regards to its establishment?
Initially, I had hoped to be able to include a clause in the bill in reference to, excuse me, a clause which would fund bodies. There was never, and the controlled sector understood this, there was never going to be a reference to any sector in the bill, including the controlled sector. But I hope to be in a position at that stage to include a clause which would refer to how we would fund bodies going into the future. As part of the deliberations with my executive colleagues, DCAL pointed out that there was already a clause existed under education legislation which allowed us to fund bodies. We brought this to the attention of the Legislative Council, and they were of the view that we could not replicate that clause in a second piece of legislation. I reported that to my executive colleagues, and I reported it to the controlled sector. And in terms of the timescale we were working to, it was agreed that I would look at a more robust way of doing it, as opposed to the clause which was in the original draft bill. I have asked my officials to go away and examine how we can give comfort to the controlled sector in relation to their body, while in fairness to them they accept that I am acting in an honourable way in terms of funding the body. I can understand that they also want to have certainty going into the future, regardless of who the administration is or who the Minister is going into the future. And I've asked my colleagues or my officials to go away and examine how we can give more of a robust underpinning to the controlled sector in this matter.
Okay, and is underpinning this by legislation, not the most robust way?
Yeah. Legislation is an option, but we have not defined how we would do that under legislation, and we're looking at other methods as to how we could underpin it as well. But legislation is one option. Okay,
thank you. Mr Moutray.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Minister, is it envisaged that the staff quota for the New Education Authority will be around 2,600 as it was envisaged for ESA, or will it be around 3,100 which was projected for the Education Boards and CCMS?
Well, I'm not in the position to put an exact figure on what the staffing levels will be for the Education Board moving into the future. That will determine on many factors, including the budget at the time and the role and remit and functions which are being carried out by the Education and Library Boards during that period. The reduction in staff in our education boards has been well documented and has been taking place in the run-up to the establishment of ANISA. And we have lost significant numbers of staff. Around 400 have left as a result of our preparations for a new administration in education. We envisage a body moving into the future which will work on its current numbers, but there may be a small reduction in those numbers required because of the amalgamation of functions. But I don't want to put a definitive limit on the amount of staff a body will need. It will depend on budgets and functions going into the future.
Sure. Okay, I appreciate that. In relation to a reduction further, do you see it prior to or subsequent to the establishment of the Education Authority?
It will be after.
After. Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
Mr. Lunn.
Thanks, Minister, for your presentation. Just around the make-up of the membership of the authority. Michelle and I can probably remember the various steps along the road here. It seems as if we've ended up with what was envisaged for ESA in terms of the overall number and the construction of it, from memory. There's no specific representation for the NICE or the Irish medium sector.
No, rightly or wrongly, I believe that we had broad agreement in relation to the proposal which was under the previous ESA bill as to how we would construct a new board. It came about from the Heads of Agreement published in November 2011, I believe. Though there's no representation for either of those two bodies, that has been clear from the outset. I believe that the board that is currently being proposed gives a broad representation of our society and allows for a management and authority style process to deliver the strategic objectives of our education system. We could end up with a board with everybody sitting on it, which may be the favourite option of some, but I don't believe that will deliver us a strategic body which is a responsibility for a £1.8 billion budget going forward.
The Heads of Agreement has been slightly discredited. And I think if the ESA bill had come before the Assembly, there would still have been some discussion about specific representation for those two sectors. So, under accelerated passage, presumably we can still have that discussion, but on the floor of the House rather than here.
Of course, and as I said at the start, this is my best guess of what I believe will reach consensus and agreement within the House. And at the end of the day, this bill is going to go before the House on the consideration stage. It certainly will be open to amendments. And I haven't the power to prevent members from bringing forward amendments or debating any topic of the bill at that stage.
The Control Schools body, there's work already been done on that. I take it that's not lost.
No, there was significant work carried out by the interim body. I would want to be in a position, once we have the first reading of the bill, to start channelling money back towards that body. My officials will be engaging with them in due course in terms of the shape of the body, and the work that was carried out previously will be a good start for it.
Will the Control Schools body represent controlled integrated schools?
The Control Schools body will represent the schools which affiliate to it. The exact mechanism as to how and who it will represent will have to be worked out through time, but I don't think it's a position for me or anyone to turn around and say to a school, well, this body will represent you or will not represent you, but those things have to be worked out. If an individual in a controlled integrated school wanted to be represented in the body, there was certainly no barrier to it.
The Chair has already referred to the timescale. Would it be effectively impossible to have this bill in place by the 1st of April if we didn't have accelerated passage?
It would not be impossible. The timescale would exist, but we wouldn't have legislative certainty around the matter. I wouldn't be in a position, and I don't think that the confidence, given the experience previously of various education bills in relation to restructuring, I don't think we would have the confidence in the sector to recruit and retain the senior personnel we require, or recruit and retain the board members we require, or indeed a chair moving forward. I think what the education sectors are calling out for now is certainty.
Yeah.
They need to be assured that the proposal that has come forward is both workable and will be in place by the 1st of April 15. And I think accelerated passage is the best way to move forward. I am concerned that if there are delays to the passage of the bill and we do not have the legislation in a robust manner or fully through by the 1st of April 2015, that our education and library boards will be in a precarious position in relation to their legislative authority.
Sorry, Chairman. Sorry, I'll have to stop saying Chairman. Chair, is the 1st of April 15 the date that the Education Board would dissolve?
Unlikely.
Or have to be reconstructed?
Well, it depends on the passage of this bill. I would hope that the bill does receive accelerated passage and then that we do know exactly where it's going. If the bill does not receive accelerated passage, then I may have to reconsider reconstituting the boards ahead of the 1st of April 2015, just to be assured that we have a governance arrangement in place. Will the ELBs dissolve on the 1st of April 2015? No, there will be a period of transfer between the ELBs and the new board.
Yeah, well, okay, well, thanks for all that. I personally haven't laboured with this thing since 2007. I'm delighted to see some urgency being put into the process, and I'm sure we're going to discuss it after you've gone, but I have a feeling you won't have any bother with me, let's put it that way, because it's just time to move on. The boards are creaking, as we all know, so thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers.
Thanks, Chair. And you're very welcome, Minister, and thanks for your presentation. I suppose the first thing I was thinking of there, in terms of ESA, one of the main objectives was to secure savings and deliver a better service in the classroom. Do you think this is still to be realised through One Education Library Board?
Well, I see this as a platform legislation, which gives us stability in our education structures, gives certainty to our education structures, but I do believe that in the future, the executive and a future education minister should return to an ESA-style model, but that will be a decision for others at that time. In relation, to answer your point, in relation to savings, while the business case has yet to be finalised and forwarded to the DFP, we envisage savings over a 10-year period of £185 million. That's money that can go into frontline education services rather than administration, etc., etc. So I think that is an important point. I think it will help us improve educational outcomes for our young people, because over this last number of years, our education boards have acted heroically in many circumstances in terms of delivering services with a reduced number of staff, uncertainty, and many people acting up several grades to ensure that services are delivered. If we deliver upon a single education authority, then it allows for certainty within posts, for morale to be raised within the education boards as well, and for a definitive plan to be outlaid in relation to CAS services and other services to our schools.
ESA predicted a reduction in staff. Will the rebooted Education Library Board carry this through?
Well, as I said to Mr Mutray, we have lost around 400 staff in the preceding years in preparation for ESA, all of those, I believe, under voluntary redundancy. If there is to be further reductions of staff in the future, I would envisage those to be limited in number, but also under voluntary redundancy as well.
Right, thank you. Minister, would it be true to say that there's no change in employer-employee relationships?
No, there will be no change. All staff will transfer to the new authority. Relevant staff will transfer to the new authority, and it will be under TUPE arrangements as well.
And in terms of change management, in terms of the change management within ESA, there was cost predicted for that change management. Will there be need for investment in change management to deliver one board?
There may be require some investment to deliver the new board over a period of years. There may be costs in relation to voluntary redundancies as well around those matters. So you may be looking at a figure of, I think it's around 11 million.
It's being identified in the FBC at the moment. There will be some, but it will be nominal. It will also be less than change management costs if we don't, and we have to reconfigure and reboot the 5 education library boards.
Okay, thank you. And just following on from Trevor, in terms of the representation in the sectoral bodies, when you think of Irish medium or integrated schools or the voluntary grammar schools, how will they feed into future education direction in terms of area planning and so on if they're not part of a sectoral?
As of now, particularly in terms of area planning, the integrated sector and the Irish medium sector have seats on the area planning delivery body, and I don't see that changing going into the future. So they will remain under statute. They will remain sectoral support bodies. There is no currently a sectoral support body for the voluntary sector. That's something which may or may not be explored in the future. But I think in terms of moving on, the future security of the Irish medium sector and the integrated sector is preserved in existing legislation. That will not change, and their sectoral support bodies will remain in place.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Mr. Craig.
Thank you, Chair, and apologies, Minister, for not being here earlier to listen to you. You've quite rightly pointed out that the existing 5 boards are on a shoestring, literally at the minute, because they were expected to be run down. The new board, when it's inaugurated, will not only take over the role of them. There has been a number of services run down dramatically within many of the boards, and all of them, unfortunately, are support services to schools. Do you envisage, when the new single board comes into play, a need to actually rebuild that expertise for schools?
Well, a lot of this is dependent on the budgets at the time, and obviously decisions taken by the board, because at the end of the day the board will be responsible for many of these matters. But there is clearly a demand from our schools for a CAS service, or a CAS style service. It has been under pressure over this last number of years. I have attempted to, over a period of time, to put in place elements of support for our school system moving forward, and I would wish to continue that, and I will engage with a future board as to how we do that. But yes, as the boards have run down, the interface between our schools and our boards has lessened, and that support hasn't been there. I would like to think that we'll be able to grow that over a period of time with the new board, because it has certainty, it knows its future direction of travel, and I think staff morale will also be greatly improved if we bring certainty into the education system.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think certainty is what's required in the system at the minute, and I welcome this bill coming forward. Minister, the other thing occurs to me, we're coming into a period of change now from 5 boards to 1 board. What help or assistance will be given it's more around communication to schools in how or who do they interface between the changeover period? Because inevitably there will be a bit of confusion in around that.
Well, there will clearly have to be a communication strategy and a change management strategy in place as we move forward, as I referred to Mr Lunn. On the 1st of April 2015, if we do receive accelerated passage from the House, we will have the legislative basis. I believe we will have a board in place to be able to move forward, but there will be a changeover period between the new board and our education and library boards, and particularly at that time it will be vital that there is a clear communication strategy with our schools.
And lastly, Chair, one of the obvious things that occurs in the existing boards is that they do appoint a number of governors to the Board of Governors of Schools, as do the main churches. Will that continue, or will there be a new setup here?
No, that will continue.
That will continue.
That's right. Change.
That moves across.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hazard.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Minister, for the presentation. I think most points have been covered, but under ESA there was a cost set aside for change management around potential of moving to different headquarters, etc. Will that be the same case now with this authority? Any discussion so far on the location of a headquarters or anything like that, or what would the timeline be?
That'll be a matter for the new board in terms of a location strategy. We refer to ESA as a regional body with a local identity. I would like to think that moving forward, and I see no reason why not, that the new board would move forward with a similar strategy in terms of a regional body but with a local identity. But in terms of location strategies for headquarters and offices, that's a matter for the board, and they would have to bring that forward to myself for approval. But I think in terms of the objective of the executive is to see government posts at arm's. We don't want to see anything centralised in Belfast either. I want to see a body which is accessible to schools, accessible to the communities it serves, moving forward.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Silverand.
Thank you very much, Chair. And yes, a lot of the questions have been covered, but I just want to go over the content or the membership of the board. It's for CCMS, for controlled sector, and for other. Is that correct?
It provides for 4 transfers and 3 trustee members moving forward. So there's a slight. The current equation used for selection for our existing education and library boards gives a small difference in terms in favour of the transfers, just by the equations broke down. We've matched that across as closely as we can to this body, so there is 4 transfers and 3 trustee members in terms of the Catholic sector.
And where do you feel that the voluntary sector and the integrated sector fit into that?
Well, they don't, because they don't currently fit into it in terms of our education and library boards. They weren't part of the clause that was in the original ESA bill. But they're not excluded in the sense that, one, they can apply under the community membership as a member of the public, as any member of the public can.
And how many places are there in that?
4 community members. But I think what we have in front of us is a representative body, both of political, community, and the 2 existing sectors under legislation, the transfers and the trustees, which gives a broad representation and allows voices from all sectors to be heard around the board table. I have no doubt that the voluntary grammar sector, the integrated sector and the Irish medium sector will be making their voices heard and are more than capable of making their voices heard of matters of concern to them.
And the unions then would probably apply to that other sector as well? Then?
They may well do. It's open to representatives of any organisation or individuals, and they would be applying as individuals to it, but it's open to anyone to apply to.
Yeah. And what other? There's only 4 places. You know, it's quite limited. Is there room to manoeuvre around those numbers, or you know?
Well, I favour the current existing numbers because we have a representative body, but it's around 20 membership plus 1 chair. Including the chair, so 20 members. In itself, is quite a big body when it comes to a public body in modern framework. It allows it to break down into committees, but it's not overly big where it becomes cumbersome in the decision-making process as well.
But it has to be representative, and that's key. Okay. Just to go back to the accelerated passage, what would the consequences be if it wasn't done and dusted then for the 1st of April? Can you put in some interim measures? Or, you know, there's...
The interim measures will be our 5 existing education and library boards, but they will be operating precariously under the legislation, because the education and library boards are supposed to be made up in conjunction with the shape and make-up of our local councils. And as you're aware, on the 1st of April 2015, our local council boundaries change. We move from 26 to 11. I have legislation which then would say that our education and library boards are supposed to be made up of the 26 council model, which no longer exists. So they are in precarious territory in relation of their legal merits. So I think we should do everything we can within our powers to ensure that doesn't happen. I also think that our education sector requires certainty. And while I think there has been general welcome for a bill coming forward thus far, there are concerns that the bill may not proceed in time or may be bogged down, and no disrespect to the committee, at committee stage or even in terms of the Assembly procedures. And I think it's evident that our education sector wants certainty. They want to be assured that by April 2015 legislation is in place, a new board is formed, that appointments are starting to take place to that board, and people see the direction of travel we're going in.
I mean, there is no doubt that they deserve certainty, and you know we all agree with that. But we're better to get the legislation right rather than to get it wrong and rush it through. So I just, for the sake of a month or 6 weeks or something, some sort of interim measure could be put in place if it wasn't. If the legislation wasn't brought through in time?
Well, our target is to have the legislation passed by November, with royal assent in a period of 4 to 6 weeks after that. If we go through full parliamentary procedure, you may not have anything in place by February. It's not 4 to 6 weeks. And the timescales we are working to are quite tight. When I'm advertising for members of boards, when we're looking for appointments to the process, I would much prefer in a position where people are certain this is going forward. And it is a 6-clause bill. It is a subject that has been much debated, both in terms of the committee and indeed several times within the Assembly and among the public and education sectors. It's probably the most hotly debated topic within the Assembly, outside some of the more broader constitutional issues, obviously. Education has been well debated.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lunn?
Yeah, thanks for letting me come back, Minister. I think that the simplicity of this is going to generate quite a lot of community interest, you know, particularly in these 4 places that are reserved for to be representative of the community in Northern Ireland. To achieve that sort of representation, if you had 10 places, it probably would be quite easy to fill them. So I think this is where there's going to be the argument really about NICE, well, about the integrated sector, about the Irish medium, and about the voluntary grammars. We had the discussion the last time, and it wasn't resolved. But would it not be simpler to give them representation as of right, and then broaden it out to the community after that? 'Cause the way it stands at the moment, you've only got 4 places. There's 3 organisations will be clamouring to have one of those places. So there's really only one left for the broader community. And I mean, we could all probably name a dozen organisations that would like to be in there. So you can find a question, you know.
Yeah, no, look, I suspect if we had 30 community places, we would no problem filling them.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, this body is a strategic management authority of a budget of £1.8 billion. The appointments to this body have to be, and I'm not ruling out anybody from any of the sectors mentioned or not mentioned, but they're there to represent education in its totality. There will be no one should be appointed to this body to represent an individual sector moving forward. I have moved the issue across from the Education and Levy Boards in terms of transfers, trustee membership, because I'm trying to match this as closely to the ELBs as possible, because I'm conscious that once you open up the education structures debate, that we could debate it for another 10 years. So I'm conscious that we do this. The 4 community members who will be appointed to the public appointments process. They won't be appointed because they are representative of Sector A, B, or C, or D. They will be appointed because they are the best candidate for the post as regulated under the public appointments process.
You said there that nobody is going to be appointed to this board to represent the specific interests of a particular body, but I mean, 7 of the members proposed actually do that, and it says represent the interest in the bill.
I also qualified that with the comment that I've kept it as close to the education bill as possible, and of course those members will do that.
Well, let me go at it a different way. I mean, how many? What's the current number of representatives on the boards as they stand at the moment? How many people are on the board?
Well, across the 4 that have fully
forget about the
membership,
South East,
about 60.
Sorry, 60.
About 60 in total.
In total, yeah. So you're bringing that down to 20. That may well be, for all I know, that might be the right figure. I really don't know. I'm just concerned about the spread of representation. I dare say we'll come back to this as the bill goes through. You know, have you any? It's probably not fair to ask you because it's nothing to do with the bill. But have you any thoughts about the number of premises you may be able to sell as a result of this?
No. I think, well, obviously all those matters are a matter for the education now, or the authority, once it comes into place and moves forward. I want to see, as I've said to Mr Hazard, a body which has accessibility at a local level as well.
Yes.
So I'm not approaching this in terms of how many retail sale or sale of property.
Well, whether it needs 5 massive headquarter buildings would be a question to be asked.
Okay, well, and a question that the board or the authority itself will have to debate.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
And that's a short intervention, Mr. Lunn.
No, so it would be short. That would be nice.
Mr. Newton.
Thank you, Chair. And like Mr. Craig, can I apologise for not being in at the commencement of your presentation, Minister. And like other members round the table, I'm glad that we've reached broad consensus and agreement on a way forward. I think that's good progress and will help provide some stability within education. In answer to a question from Mr. Craig, you indicated there's a significant degree of change, so you have to have a change management strategy. What would a change management strategy look like in terms of achieving the objectives and the outcomes of what you want here?
Well, in the broad principles of it, obviously, there will have to be the central task, in my opinion, is a communication strategy, both among staff of the existing boards and our schools who the board service. Also in terms of how and the workings of the new body in terms of the legislation moving forward, the appointment of new directors to that body, the day-to-day workings of the body will all have to be dealt with as we move closer to the actual turning off of the Education and Library Boards and the move into the authority in full. Those are the broad themes of it. I don't know if any of my colleagues want to come in terms of...
There'll be 6 or 7 broad projects or areas of work that will comprise a programme. They have largely been covered there by the Minister. You need a set of governance arrangements, you need work to transfer workforces, you need to develop a cut-over strategy so that the employees and the services delivered by the workforce have a plan for their first day. It's that sort of thing. And then maybe the change process continues then after first day, consolidating, probably for some years.
Yeah.
Some years?
Probably, yeah.
You would envisage then that the element of change internally would go on as the process, the amalgamation was taking place, so on and so forth.
Yes, no government structure or no arm's-length body remains the same in the sense of its delivery of services to the public. As this body establishes itself and they work through the urgent matters in terms of staffing, etc., all those matters, and they consolidate their position, I think it's only right and proper that one of the next steps would be to take a look at the future and how they see education being delivered in the future. Now, it's not up to me to dictate to them their work agenda or their work programme. That will be a matter for the board, but all our public bodies, I would hope, would sit back and say, well, where do we see ourselves in 5 or 10 years' time, or 15 years' time, going down the road, and how we deliver our services. So change is constant. It's the scale of the change, I suppose, is the big question. That question can't be answered until the board establishes itself and starts making decisions.
With respect, Minister, a change management policy, I would have thought, needs to be in place before you actually start the process.
Well, the broad outlines or headlines in terms of the change between the ELBs and the authority, I have outlined to you, but I suspect I would not have the authority to impose a change management plan on the new board. I suspect if you were sitting on the new board, first thing you would say is, who does the Minister think he is? We'll rip that up and we'll start again.
Right, I used the word policy, change management policy. In a reply to Mr Moutry, you indicated that all staff would transfer.
Well, I replied to Mr Moutry that a lot of it will depend on budgets in terms of what is required within the new board. There may be further voluntary redundancies between now and the establishment or after the establishment of the new authority, but I don't expect large-scale redundancies as a result of this change, because we have went through several years of scaling back the boards. I think around 400 staff, or just over 400 staff, have left the service.
And then in terms of, within your change, those who transfer over, when do you address the issue of their job descriptions, terms of reference, terms of employment, and so on and so forth?
Yeah.
That is one of the major projects that has to agree new schemes as part of the transfer schemes, and would have to have those things in place for the first day of operation of. That's one of the bare minimums referred to in the Ministers. That's one of the reasons for accelerated passage, indeed. Those things have to be in place, proper employment arrangements, for the first full day of operation of the new body.
Yeah. So people are going to transfer over, all of them, except the 400 who have taken their redundancies at the moment. Of those, what percentage is that? 400? How many?
There will actually be 35,000.
35,000.
The teaching, school-based workforce are out of scope here, obviously.
Yes.
In terms of the relevant workforce, it's currently about 3,000 or 2,900 perhaps, and they shall come over in large schemes of transfer. So 400 has come out to reduce them down to that total already.
What was the total again?
Sorry, it's about 2,600 now. 427 have come out.
Was 3,000.
Yes, that's
2,600, and you've lost 400 over what
Exactly.
period?
So what's that? It's about a sixth have come out since
Over what period?
2010.
100 a year.
On the 7th.
I mean, I would have to express my background, Chair, sir, would have taken me into the era of change management. I would have to express my concerns at this stage if you achieve the accelerated passage timescale, and yet this process of change management strategy or policy isn't actually in place as yet.
Okay, it's a fair enough expression of concern, but you're working on the basis that everything changes ultimately on the 1st of April 2015. It won't.
No, well, no, that's the premise I'm not working on. I'm working on the premise that if you want to go there, you've already started. You already have the policy.
Well, matters have moved quite quickly in this last number of weeks in terms of moving this bill forward, and pieces of the jigsaw falling into place. The executive have made a number of decisions, and indeed they gave me permission to produce the bill only last Thursday, and we've been moving on from then. So there are matters which require urgent attention, and we want to move as quickly as possible. But I need, and the reason we're here for seeking accelerated passage is because we need legislative certainty. I believe that the Education and Library Boards will be in a precarious legal position from the 1st of April 2015 onwards if we don't have a plan in place to replace them. And I think, and I know as we move through the legislative process, that the factors that you're talking about can and will be dealt with, and only when we are satisfied that governance arrangements are in place, that the change management has been properly managed and there's a direction of travel to move forward, will we move from the 5 Education and Library Boards to the one authority.
I think obviously the concern would be that given our previous experience with the other bills, we had many background papers detailing structures and processes moving forward, and this is an entirely different beast that we're dealing with, and obviously there's a lack of detail surrounding that. But obviously we'd be looking for assurance that the committee would be given that information as you have it and as we move forward, so that we would have the opportunity to scrutinise that as well.
Yes, with no difficulty in that. We will share information with the committee and engage with the committee around the change management process or any process in relation to the move, both this legislation moving forward and our move towards a single authority. We no difficulty with that.
Okay. Anything further, Mr.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Mr. Rogers.
Thanks, Minister, again. In answer to an earlier question when I talked about Irish medium and integrated and the bonded grammar, and you went on to talk about the strategic management, this new authority, we're very much a strategic management authority. One of the big items for strategic management over this next number of years is going to be area-based planning. We know that. But some of the initial attempts at area-based planning, some of those sectors felt that they didn't have real input into it. And if you consider that over 50% of our post-primary school population go to those sectors, do you not believe that, as of right, those sectors should have better representation on the board?
Well, no. I think what we have in front of us now is a body which allows for strategic oversight of our education system. We can have every and any sector represented on the board. We can feasibly do that. But what I am looking for is a strategic body. I'm looking for a body which has an overarching responsibility for our education system, will look towards the future, will engage with all our education sectors, will work with our education sectors moving forward. And I believe the shape and context of the body as currently proposed in the bill gives us that sense of strategy, of management, of authority to move forward.
Do you think that we didn't get it right the first time with area-based planning because these people weren't really around that strategic table?
I don't agree with you that we didn't get it right. The area planning has been an evolving piece of work. I accepted the arguments from the controls, or from the Irish medium sector and from the integrated sector, that they should be represented at the table. They're now represented at the table. Area planning is a living, working policy. Decisions I've made in recent days have been based on the work of area planning. Decisions I will make in the future are based on area planning. So area planning is working. People may not agree with the individual decisions coming out of it. They may not agree with the pace of change. They may think it's too fast or too slow or whatever, but it is working.
Okay.
Thank you. Mr. Newton.
Thank you, Chair. Just a very, very short question, Chair. Minister, would you expect after this process is completed that the human resources bill will be less?
I don't. Yes, I suspect it will be, but I don't think, in terms of planning for the new authority, it should be simply focused on the reducing of staff. I think what will bear down upon the authority is the budget constraints we're all going to be facing. But the authority will have to plan out its own human resources strategy and needs, and then match that against its budget. But for clarity, I don't expect in the first period of years for it to be significantly less. Because we have been through a period of significant job reduction in education.
That's fine, Chair.
And do you foresee any need for further legislation after this?
I hope not. Well, as I say, I think it was to Mr. Clark, not in my period. If I'm Minister by 2016, where the next election is, I don't see it, but I do believe in the future that an executive should return to an ESA type of authority. This would be a platform piece of legislation to build upon that, and it gives certainty to our education system, but that's only my opinion. That's a matter for another executive.
Okay. Obviously, I wasn't keen on the last few bills, but what I did actually like within the last bill was the support provision with regard to improving child protection, and obviously that isn't in this bill. Can you give any assurance, sort of moving forward, as to whether or not you'll return to that?
Well, once we have completed this legislative journey, we will do, for want of a better term, a post-mortem on the ESA legislation. And if it's believed that there's a requirement, that there was clauses within the ESA legislation that should be brought forward, then I'm more than content to bring them forward as a part of a miscellaneous bill, or attach them to another piece of legislation.
Okay. Well, thank you for your time. And
thank you.
I understand that Paul is leaving at the end of the week.
That's right, yes.
Can I wish you well in your new post? I believe you may be following the previous chair.
That's right, yeah.
So I wish you well with that, and just to thank you for the contributions that you made to education in your time at the department. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Are members content that the clerk would maybe draft a letter for us just in relation to sort of some of the key figures that we've asked for, particularly around sort of change management and the new structures that are moving forward, just so that we can flesh out some of the information which we received today.
Great.
Did we ask him another question? I didn't like to come back in again, you know.
Don't be shy, Mr. Lunn.
No, well, I'm naturally shy, you know. The discussion we had there about area planning, it wouldn't be fair to ask the Minister directly about the Drumrad judgment, but the judge did point out that the needs model in terms of area planning was defective, and that the interest of there should be a requirement to assess the potential for growth of the integrated sector when you're considering area planning. But the voluntary grammars, Irish medium and integrated sectors all thought that they weren't really very well represented in that process, and they're not going to be represented in this body per se.
Again, that might be something maybe you want to raise then, if accelerated passage is agreed then on the 14th.
Yeah, well, I can raise it with them through another avenue, but if we're going to ask them for clarifications, it might be worthwhile to just throw that in. You know.
Okay.
I think, Chair, so write to the department in those terms. Just to remind members, the department's coming to us on the 8th of October to talk about area planning, so I could give them a heads up about the question.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, moving now to our next briefing, which is the October monitoring round. Just refer you to cover note at page 123. September update on the DE capital programmes tabled item, as is DFP information on the resource outturn for 2013 and 14, and the department's briefing paper has been tabled. Welcome, Trevor Connolly, Director of Finance, Philip Irwin, Director of Investment and Infrastructure, and Gavin Patrick, who is the Deputy Finance Director. You're all very welcome to committee. Although I have to say from the outset, I am disappointed that papers were late, and I would hope that in future that doesn't happen. Maybe could have been minded not to have cancelled the briefing, but we are where we are. But can I ask you to make an opening statement, and we'll follow up with some questions if you don't mind.
Thank you, and apologies for the delay in terms of the paper. I think really just very summary, on the front you'll see, you know, we've emphasised the Minister has not yet finalised whether he wants to make any bids to October monitoring, and the details at this stage are for information. The paper itself is very short, and I don't consider going through it any more in terms of detail. Just happy to take any questions yourself and members have.
Okay, thank you. And I know that we are getting a briefing on the 22nd of October to discuss the capital spend, but I suppose really sort of looking at the figures and the fact that the £40 million planned expenditure on school new builds has been reduced to £23 million. We obviously like an explanation with regard to that. This does look like the capital programme is really all over the place, and there doesn't really appear to be a clear strategy with regards to that, but maybe you'd like to give some more information around that.
Happy to do that. And maybe the starting point for that should be just to explain the process that we operate, because the comparison you're making there between the 40 million and the 23.7, which I assume is what you're talking about in the column, isn't in a sense the correct comparator. And to try and explain that, I'll talk you through the process that we operate in managing the budget through a financial year. The figures that are shown there in the first column, the 14-15 initial budget, are figures that are issued to the various parts of the system as indicative allocations in February-March time. So the focus of the department at that time is very much on landing the in-year. We're coming towards the end of the financial year and landing the in-year. So those figures are effectively a top-down slicing of the budget that we have been allocated for the following year to give the various different parts of the department an indication of the scope of the budget that they're likely to have in the following year. After we get through year end, we actually do it the other way around. We build a budget bottom up. We ask each of the project managers to identify month by month the spend through the year, and we then at that point allocate specific budget to each of the different lines in that table. So the number that is the direct comparator, if you like, the budget that was allocated across each of the projects at that time was 28,861 on the major projects, and in fact the SEP projects went the other way. The initial allocation there was, when we built it bottom up, when we took the figures in from the project managers, was 12.2 million. Now, as we go through the year, these things are moving all the time, just by their nature. So if you take the SEP projects, for example, the 12.2 million, whenever we looked at the detail of that, more than half of that spend was indicated to be in March 2015. So if there had been 2, 3, 4 weeks slip between June of this year and next March, we would obviously lose that entire month. We'd lose half of the 12 million. And hence, in again looking at each individual project in a more detailed way, that 12 million has moved to the 8 million that you see in the table there at the moment for SEP. So the budget is a continually moving feast. The way that it is managed, as I've said, is we give people an indicative allocation prior to the financial year. We then do a bottom-up detailed allocation at the beginning of the year, in the first quarter of the year, and then we'll manage it as we go on a monthly basis thereafter. And typically what will happen will be, as and when things change and there are issues and slippages, that additional budget that is generated for whatever reason, we will usually apply to the minor works, because those projects we're able to specify them and deliver them in year, and therefore we're able to achieve something with the money rather than simply losing the money.
I mean, certainly minor works make a huge difference to some schools, be it just sort of new roofs, extension for classrooms and so on as well. But is there any chance that this capital programme may have to be reallocated again before the end of the year? It's
reallocated every month. I mean, in a sense that for example, we agreed to a major project, the appointment of the contractor. We signed it off last week. That contractor will be on site in November. The winning bid was 300,000 below our pre-tender estimate. Therefore, next month, when that particular project is reviewed, the equivalent amount of money that is currently showing in that 23,722 will come down, because the actual winning contractor is lower than we anticipated it to be. We will reallocate that money into minor works, and at this time of year we should be in a position whereby we'll be able to identify a minor work that we'll be able to deliver in year. It becomes a lot more difficult when you get towards the end of the year and into the last 3 months, where if the money becomes available for whatever reason, finding a project, specifying it, procuring it and delivering it all within 3 months becomes very, very difficult. But that is continuing on a monthly basis and a weekly basis. Yeah. That would obviously be a concern, that money would then go unspent. Well, I mean that's our job. That's the process. The process we have in place to manage that. And as I say, the Schools Enhancement Programme is a particularly difficult one in this year, because those projects, there are 50 different projects, all running in parallel. A lot of them on very similar timeframes, and a lot of them programmed to go on site in February and March. So it only needs the slightest slip between now and then, and cumulatively those projects can, as I've said, have programmed a lot of spend in March. If we lose 1 month, we've got the potential to lose that budget. So obviously that, again, the reason that we over-programme at this point in the year is to deal with matters such as that come February and March next year.
There's a reduction in the money for Lissanelli. What's the explanation for that?
Again, the first column there was an indicative top-down picture, most of them to the nearest 5 million, of what budget would be available. The right-hand column is the bottom-up numbers that we then received in from the Lissanelli team. So the 4.88 is the bottom-up picture, and I don't think that figure has changed in year. So I actually don't think there has been a change to the Lissanelli figure from we received the first input from the project managers to the most recent ones for the October monitoring round.
Okay, and I've very recently changed hats, so as the former chair of the CAL committee, obviously interested in the technical issue where there's £1 million transferring over for the UK City of Culture Legacy Project. What was that in relation to?
Well, it says it's up to £1 million, and the details are actually being agreed between us and DCAL. In terms of, I don't have any information here specifically. The transfer will be actioned. We can only transfer money between departments, as you know, through monitoring rounds. So, if you like, my policy colleagues are working with DCAL to actually work at that, and that's why specifically we've said up to £1 million, because we haven't actually agreed precisely what the amount of money to transfer is.
And they will be on education projects?
Oh, absolutely, yes. Because it's our money, so in terms of our VREs, we can only transfer money, you know, in terms of out of the education budget, which is compatible and consistent with the Minister's objectives.
Okay, we'll open up to other members. We have Mr Rogers.
Thank you, gentlemen. You're very welcome. In terms of the school enhancement project, just want to clarify in your own mind, there's 27 of those projects are really at the start of a procurement process now. There's about another, I think it was 50, another 24 then.
Yes, 50,
hopefully.
50,
Well, there are 50 projects altogether.
51 altogether.
Yeah.
What I'm thinking about is that
50 now.
50, right.
Yeah.
Well, then that other 23 that's waiting, does that really depend on the budget allocation next year for that?
None of them are, I should point out, none of them are waiting. We have told all of the projects and the project managers to keep moving as quickly as they can through the process. At some point when we as we go through, at the point where we're allocating or appointing a contractor, we do have to stand back and think about the budget for next year and how much of next year's budget that is likely to consume. For the projects that are, and at this point in time, we do not have a budget for next year. But as we stand at the moment, we're taking the view, or working on the basis that, if you like, that top-down allocation that I talked about, that the 40 million came from, that the total will be in the same or a similar region to what we have in this year that we will have next year. So we're able to keep appointing and progressing the SEP projects, certainly over the next number of months, the number that will come to fruition. As and when we get a lot of those on site, we may have to start thinking about what is our position likely to be next year, and do we get into a position where we potentially compromise either minor works or other major works if we put too many schools enhancement programme projects through. But if we assume that our budget will be in a similar territory to where it is this year, I don't think there's going to be a significant constraint on those projects.
I think, Sean, there's an element of chicken and egg in terms of your question, because one of the criteria the DFP would use when looking at capital, because of its intrinsically demand-led nature, is the contractual commitments that you have. Our difficulty is that we have a large number of relatively small contracts. Even the major works, you know, are maybe sort of 25, 30 million in total, and that's over a period of years. So compared to say a hospital and stuff, which is literally in the hundreds of millions, we wouldn't have that. But what we're doing, as Philip says, is progressing the SEP through. As and when the executive agree what our capital allocation, that'll obviously play into, if you like, the mix. So if you like, the way I would look at it, you've got a volume constraint which will be agreed by the executive, and then the mix will come through as regards. And I would think probably next year the SEP figure will be significantly higher than it is this year. But part of ours is that we're moving forward so that as and when the executive agree the capital budget, we can say, well, actually, here is the contractual commitments that we have. So if you don't move forward, you don't have contractual commitments. If you don't have contractual commitments, it's hard to argue for the same level of budget. So, and I suppose the other thing is that, you know, strategically, there's not the same level of pressure on the capital budget as clearly there is on the resource budget. You know, I'm thinking in terms of a UK level. So we would hope that even if we don't necessarily get all the funding we require, we may have an opportunity to put bids in next year and further, which could be successful in terms of on the construction side.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
But when you do make bids for major projects, there's obviously an expectation, and you raise an expectation within communities and in schools. And obviously then whenever they aren't delivered on, then that creates a problem. What schools will not go forward as a result of this reorganisation of the budgets?
Well, again, I don't think there's no project that we have slowed down because of budget constraints. I mean, the Minister's made it clear for the major projects that he's announced, you know, they will take priority as far as allocation of budget is concerned. And as Trevor has said, where we have contractual commitments at a point in time when we know what our budget is going forward, those projects will take priority. In the same way as the minor works has been the beneficiary of the increase in budget and our, I suppose, the difficulty in getting the major projects up doubled at the same that step change instantly. Minor works has been the budget that has effectively doubled in this year. The other side of that coin will be that as the budget maybe gets constrained, the major works and the SEPs will get first bite at it, and it's the minor works budget that is likely to be constrained in those years going forward. But that's all dependent on the actual level of budget that we are offered.
And I think that's our budget for the last 3 years in capital has roughly been 100 million. You can see it nearly doubles. So there's a huge step change, and part of that difficulty is having projects in the pipeline that you can certainly just switch on. And clearly, when you're doing major works, the procurement and design, etc., it just doesn't avail itself. The shovel ready is a great concept, except for the fact that you have to have done all the work and have the contractor ready to go, and then you tell them that you have the funding. So I think that's part of it. As Philip says, there's a phasing here in terms of the elements of major works will increase, have increased this year compared to last, and probably will increase significantly again, yeah, assuming that we get something similar in 15-16, because that's actually what we need. I suppose to a certain extent, we need to build on this level to be able to justify that we need something similar to 180 million next year, and hence have the pipeline. And once you have that and that degree of certainty, and whenever we get to a 16-17 sort of 2 or 3 year budget, then you can turn around and say, look, we can deliver 180 million and the number of schools that can actually build.
Yeah, and I appreciate what you've both said, but obviously whenever announcements are made, then there's expectations are created, and where you currently have that money. And I understand the process is incredibly long, and it's not always recognised that it does take so long, and could be an issue around planning and so on that can knock a project off skew. But then that delivers it on further down the line when you don't have the money.
Can I maybe make a comment on that? Because that's a different issue. I mean, everything we've been talking about here is more about managing budget in year. It's not budget constraints that have, if you like, caused the delays in some of the major projects. And I know we have another session with you in 2 or 3 weeks' time, and we'll probably talk about some of this in more detail. But our 2013 announcement in particular, and I should point out and agree that the public don't necessarily understand it, but the Minister's announcement was to advance those projects in planning. It wasn't to get a digger on site next day. As you rightly say, there are a lot of processes that have to be gone through to actually deliver the project. But the 2013 list in particular, the protocol that was used to do that was actually deliberately set up to try and encourage rationalisation, amalgamations and so on. So a lot of the projects that came out of that process were amalgamations or rationalisations in schools. And I think the theory when the protocol was put together was that by announcing it as a project that would advance to a new build, this would assist the difficult process. Any amalgamation process or rationalisation process can be difficult. The idea was that this would assist because there was the carrot of a new build at the end of the process. As it has turned out, that hasn't really been the case. All of the difficulties that they've had around different schools either amalgamating or the estate being rationalised have existed anyway. And we were not in a position to take a lot of those projects forward until the statutory area planning processes were sorted out. So for that particular announcement, a lot of those difficulties have, if you like, kept us on the start line for a long time, and the process is therefore more extended than maybe we would like as well. For the 2014 announcement that was made back in June this year, we changed the protocol in such a way that any schools where that area planning uncertainty existed, we simply didn't consider them and score them in the protocol. So we would hope and anticipate that the 2014 schools should be able to progress much more quickly than a lot of the 2013 ones where that uncertainty in the area planning still exists in a lot of cases.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Long.
Could you just put me over the asset disposal side of this? I take it that means redundant schools.
Yeah, well, again, it depends on the school. Basically, where a school has been vacated, where it's a board-controlled school, the board will take responsibility for disposing of the asset and disposing of the site and trying to maximise the value of that site. Where it's a non-controlled school, the site belongs to the trustees.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the ones that the board owns, which I would guess would be most of the ones that are out there and currently vacant. Maybe I'm wrong. It seems to be an awful slow it's a slow process to build a new one, but it seems to be an awful slow process to sell an old one. Have you any idea how many schools would be in that category, where they're lying vacant, they're owned by the boards, and there's no particular movement on trying to maximise the value of them?
I couldn't give you a number off the top of my head, a total number, but I can say that at quarterly meetings that we have with the boards, we review the sites that they are actively progressing a sale, and numbers are not significant. And I have to say there are a lot of sites where the board would say they have great difficulty in actually selling the site. That
but they don't seem to. It seems to be almost the last resort. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but to just put a sign up for sale. They seem to spend an awful lot of time hunting around looking for a potential buyer through other means.
Well, there is a clearly defined protocol within the public sector where those sites, before they can be put up for sale, are a process that's managed by LPS, where they are basically advertised around the entire public sector. So the public sector get first call on those sites before they are able to be put on general sale, if you like.
Yeah, you would think of this time of austerity and cuts and trying to, not work with less than what you had before. That system could possibly be capable of review, because I'm sure I can think of a couple of schools in my particular area where at least 5 years, maybe longer, since they were empty.
Right.
And I really do wonder how long does this take, and when does LPS or the department, whoever owns them, just take a decision, put up for sale and see what happens,
I suppose the obvious thing is in the current environment, the last 4 or 5 years, selling property has been a challenging occupation. So
yeah, but so is maintaining them.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
yes.
that was where I was coming to. That you can decide, you can make a commercial decision. It would be better to hold off here for a couple of years before we sell this, because we're on a rising market, which never seems to arrive. But you've got to look at the maintenance side of it too.
No, and there's no doubt, and there are security issues and so on as well.
Yes.
But I think Trevor's point's a very good one, and maybe we're starting to see the market turn a little bit, but there hasn't been a lot of a market for speculative purchases of sites over the last number of years.
The one other point, probably one of the reasons the 500 is actually, if you like, on my side, because we treat from a budget side receipts slightly different from capital. So I would always want to have, if you like, a round sum amount in there that I don't know if Philip's actually going to achieve or not, but in the opening budget we always want to have a figure lodged, and then we can sort of decrease and increase rather than change it, and that's why it's such a round sum amount. It's not because we're sitting down planning this. We're simply saying from a budget perspective, because receipts are from a budget perspective slightly different from a capital.
I take it when you say a round sum amount, you mean an estimate. And that's
the 500,000.
That's fair enough. We haven't made a tremendously successful job of closing schools so far. I'm not advocating that we go out and close a couple of hundred, but we all know that there has been schools closed and amalgamated over the last number of years. And yet, that seems like a mighty pessimistic.
Well, I think actually again that was that estimate. I think we will over deliver on that, but I still take your point that there are a lot of schools that remain.
Like last year, it was roughly about 3 or 4 million, because we actually gave up last year some additional receipts because of the fact that we actually overachieved. So the 500,000 is what we would have started with, but I suppose from my perspective, if you like, from the finance perspective, Trevor, it's when those receipts are achieved. If they're more than the figure that we have in the budget, we give those up as effectively a reduced requirement back to the centre, which is the normal protocol. But last year, I think we actually gave back sort of 2 or 3 million more above our baseline. So there are sales happening, but no, I take your point, because if you like, from the resource side, those costs of maintenance and security are hitting the boards and hitting the resource side, which is under tremendous pressure. So I fully recognise the point.
Yeah, but it's bad enough maintaining schools that are earmarked for closure, but it's even worse to think maintaining schools which have already been closed, if there's an alternative. But anyway, that's the point I want to make. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mrs. Overend.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you very much for your information. A lot of it's been covered, I suppose, with the capital bills, etc. As the Chair said, when announcements are made, there are expectations, and not only by the schools themselves who think that they're getting further down the line, but by those that are working within the construction industry. As someone who came from the Enterprise Trade and Investment Committee, that's where a lot of the lobby would have come to me. Obviously, there are expectations that there will be work here in Northern Ireland, and the delays in that have consequences for their businesses as well. So I just really wanted to tease out, or you've maybe answered at all, but do you know what causes those delays, or what can be changed? Is it within the department or with other aspects of joint up government to progress those projects further?
Well, as I said, I think the biggest issue with the 2013 list was the area planning uncertainties, and I think we've tried to address that through the protocol that was used for 2014. We have also changed the way in which we are progressing those projects. The 2013 projects were, I suppose, the department was taking a quite hands-off approach with the schools, the boards, whoever the managing authority was, to bring them forward. Whereas with the 2014 projects, we're maybe taking a more centralised approach. So for the process to prepare the EAs, the business cases, we have commissioned all. The EA process involves a site search process, which is, if you like, compulsory from a DFP perspective in terms of approving these. A technical feasibility process for the different sites that have been identified, and that then feeds the preparation of the business case. We have commissioned the site search for all of the projects that were announced centrally with LPS, rather than allowing the 14 different schools, if you like, to manage and run that process themselves. We are again centrally, I think for maybe all but a couple where maybe work had been done in the past, going to commission the technical feasibility work. So there will be procurement that will be issued within the next few weeks, and we'll divide it down into 2 or possibly 3 tranches, where we will bring in professional teams to undertake that technical feasibility work within a set time frame. And then again, centrally or in conjunction with the boards, depending on where resources are and who's best placed to deliver them, we are going to take the lead on the preparation of the business cases as well. So I would anticipate and hope, and suppose like anything, we'll not know until we actually do it if it has improved things, but I would hope that the business cases for the 2014 list will be signed off much more quickly than has been the case for the 2013 list, where, as I say, we acknowledge there have been difficulties in progressing those. And as we move forward then, once the business cases are signed off, in terms of the interaction with the schools and the actual project boards that will be set up to run those projects, we have started taking a much more hands-on approach in terms of sitting on those boards and working with the schools as part of the delivery process. Probably traditionally we would have stood back, and the schools who are the contracting authorities, in these cases the boards or the trustees of the maintained schools or the contracting authorities, would have allowed them effectively to run that process and have been slightly remote from it. We're taking a much more hands-on approach in terms of the delivery process. It's like anything, I suppose. The 2013 list and the 2013 protocol wasn't designed to be slow. It was designed the way it was for what we're seeing as good reasons at the time. What we're doing now is aimed at accelerating this whole delivery process. I suppose the proof of the pudding will be in the eating.
And I think, Chair, just in terms of sort of, if you like, our historic ability to spend and as a tribute to Philip and Dermot, his predecessor, over the last 3 years, our underspend has been less than £1 million per year, less than 1%. So it may be back to sort of the point I had with Sean and Trevor, that the mix is different, but in terms of sort of the volume of work that's going through construction, like effectively in each of the last 3 years, we have been, spending our budget.
Yeah, and it's
near stand at 99 point something percent.
I suppose the difference, maybe the minor works is carried by different types of businesses as well. So I suppose that's.
And I was briefing CEF last week, and while I would agree with you, there's still a degree of frustration from maybe some of the bigger companies who are only interested in jobs that are 25 million plus.
Yes.
A lot of the smaller companies said they had really noticed a difference in terms of the jobs that are going out, the minor works jobs that they would be involved in. And we're very positive about. We put a whole series of new processes in place for delivery of minor works last autumn, where we added additional resources to the boards, and the boards are effectively acting as delivery agent in the non-controlled schools as well. And that process seems to be working very well. And as I said, the industry were quite complementary. The parts of the industry that were operating in that territory were complementary about the step change in work that has taken place, and their ability to deliver it as well.
And I suppose that the school enhancement programme is being 50 individual projects, all of which are just less than 5 million.
Yep.
But are if you like, the middle ground between sort of the small minor works and the huge big project, I think the fact that those 50 and obviously distributed across the country, and they'll be actioned in the next 12, 24 months, but that's maybe also being able to have the sort of the bigger people can actually say, right, well, here's something that's of a sufficient critical mass for us to get interested in, rather than just the sub sort of 500,000, which is how we define minor works.
Good to get a good balance.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that. Just on another subject, I was thinking about. I just come into education over the summertime, and the teacher redundancies was the big story over the summertime. And there was a certain amount that weren't able to achieve the redundancies that they had hoped for. Where's the funding? Where are we at now with those that didn't get? Do they fit into the
there's
funding?
two things. The teachers who didn't get, it wasn't due to lack of funding, it was that their application didn't comply with the criteria, and I think we're.
Was the criteria not changed because there was a lack of funding? Not.
Well, the ultimate was that we actually were overcommitted at the end, in terms of the fact that we actually had roughly about a 4 million overcommitment. But the rationale that was used was, and I'm a variance expert, but we used those schools who were in financial difficulty at March 2014, and then, if you like, logically that moved to March 2015, because the boards came back and said, well, look, that's fine because that's historical fact, but you also have schools who are actually, properly planning forward and saying, well, look, we're in difficulties now. We want to actually take action at August 2014 to prevent us being in a deficit at March 2015. And that was, if you like, the second iteration. But from the perspective in terms of the decision making, it wasn't the fact that we turned around and said, oh no, there is insufficient. The minister had decided that if you pass the criteria, you will be funded, and that's why we actually had an overcommitment. We wrote to the committee to say we had a marginal overcommitment. So certainly from my side,
Explain
it wasn't
to me what that means, an overcommitment. What does that mean?
Well, it meant that we actually were putting funding out that we didn't have at that time.
Right.
So we were actually saying that we were overcommitted in terms of the redundancies, because clearly there was a timing issue in terms of wanting to have teachers being able to get away for the 31st of July or 31st of August, which is their normal time frame.
So what about that overcommitment now? Where did that funding come from?
That funding has been taken out of the 29 million that the minister had set aside for the welfare reform.
Okay. And so I just noticed that the minister said that he is still considering whether he wishes to make any bids to the October monitoring. Then do we get sight of those whenever he makes that decision? Or?
Yes, absolutely, yes. The actual date, the timeline is Thursday.
Right.
that's the timeline. So yes, whatever return the decision the Minister makes, of course, yes, we'll copy the committee.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Mr. Newton.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just pursue the theme that Mr. Lunn was on in terms of £11 million for maintenance, and in terms of is there a breakdown ever in terms of the schools that are active and ongoing and so on, schools that are perhaps there is a question mark on their actual long-term survival, and then those schools that are already closed, and what chunk of the budget or what percentage of the budget is each of those categories eating up?
I have a breakdown by board. I don't have a breakdown by, if you like, the category of school as you've categorised them there. But the boards at the moment, given the constraints that we've had on maintenance spending, are prioritising health and safety issues within obviously the operating schools, and what is left or what is required for schools that have been vacated, will be the minimum that they can get away with, to put it another way. But I don't have it categorised in that way. We don't. I would need to go back, and it's something I can forward.
Yeah, I think if you want to ask through the Chair that question, we can
dig that out. Right. Yeah.
It's a bit interesting, Chair. And can I take you back to another part of your previous answers, in terms of the sale of the asset? And can I particularise this to Orangefield High School? As I understand it, the board are actually going to occupy part of Orangefield High School. Now that leaves surrounding buildings, as I understand it, that will very, very quickly become a blight on that community. So if the board are able to occupy a part of the site, what process or how long will it take for the remainder of the site to actually be disposed of in whatever way that would take place?
Coming back to the actual process, as I understand it, and I can't quote the actual timeline, but as I understand it, at the point where the board would describe the asset as surplus, and I assume at this point in time they haven't done that, because if they are going to reuse it, and my understanding as well is that site had the potential for some other projects in that area where rationalisations potentially could take place. So as part of area planning, that site they may have other ideas as to how the site could be used. But let's say they got to a point where this site or some part of the site was declared surplus. That information is given to LPS, who say effectively touted around the public sector. There is a fixed window by which public sector bodies have an opportunity to respond and to express an interest, and that is a fixed window. I think the issue is, and the reason we get into some of the difficulty that maybe you'd alluded to earlier on, is at the point where they express an interest, they then have to have the budget to actually transfer the asset, and on many occasions that depends on their budget situation and depends on whatever project they have in mind for that site, how long it will take to have that project funded and delivered. And that's where you get into, it seems to be sitting there for 2 years and nothing happening. So for that particular site, I can't give you any details as to what the Belfast Board's plans are, but I think it hasn't reached the point where it is officially declared as surplus.
Chair, can I just, you said that it might be sitting there for 2 years. Some indication of what would be an expected time to get rid of a building that is surplus to requirement?
Well, I can speak better maybe from a previous role when I was looking after the Office Estate and DFP, and we would certainly, the LPS process within the public sector has a set time frame, which is months. I can't remember the exact amount, but let's say it's 3 to 6 months for a public sector organisation to express a firm interest in it. If they don't come back and express an interest in it, that can go on the market immediately. Now, I know again from experience that various sites that went through that process at that time, which was 2-3 years ago, sat on the market for 2-3 years. And I'm thinking of one in particular, a relatively what we would have thought was a prime development site in Belfast. Ultimately, the public sector Office of State had to go back in and refurbish the building that was there and start reusing it again, because the market simply wasn't there. The interest wasn't there to purchase it. So it does depend on the asset, where it is, and what level of interest the market has in that particular site, in that particular asset.
But it lying dormant for 2 to 3 years wouldn't be uncommon.
No. And for potentially a small rural primary school, it could be a significant. It could be a significant period, because if there isn't a development potential there, what do you do with it?
And you're then required to maintain the building.
Yeah.
For whatever those.
Yeah, well, not necessarily material. There would be circumstances where the board, if it's a board site, would put the case to us that they should demolish the school, and therefore
which reduces the costs and the security.
That would be typical. That would be typical. Where potentially some other public sector organisation hasn't expressed an interest in that building, then you get into difficulty of, when does that get sorted out and agreed? Are they going to buy it or are they not? Versus we as the education sector would really like to demolish what's there.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Lunn.
Just on the same thing, the whole process seems ponderous. It's not entirely your fault. It's LPS are involved there as well. But if another public body within the 6 months expresses an interest in the property, does that mean it's on hold for as long as they take to make up their mind?
Ultimately, we can, or we as the seller or the public sector vendor, can ultimately say, look, at some point here you have to put up or walk away, in terms of confirm that you have the funding and transfer the asset, or not.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, well, I was just going to say, but inevitably, what happens is budgets are not confirmed at a point in time. We're all sitting here with no visibility of what budget we have from a capital perspective from April onward. Maybe the project is a community project that is, obviously led by some other department somewhere that is maybe very important to them, and therefore it's, unless we had some clear reason for selling the site to a different purchaser, it's difficult to, from an overall public sector perspective.
There would be, if you like, a joint element of negotiation from Philip and May to, say, the finance director of the other department to say, look, are you going to do this, or is this on the long finger, or what's happening? Because, and certainly I've had experience where there's been exchanges of correspondence between ministers, because and sometimes it's actually subject to a bid being successful, which then prolongs the timescale as well. But yes, there's always going to be an element of interaction and negotiation on that.
Yeah. It's just it's not very commercial, I mean, in the ordinary way, you would, fair enough, if you could find somebody privately or through back channels who wanted to take over an asset, you might work that way. Next stage would be to put it up for sale. Next stage after that is to put it up for auction. And then you find out what the market value is. And I don't think we ever get to that. Do we ever get to the stage of actually auctioning an old site?
We definitely did at a point in time. I'm not sure, again, not from a school's perspective, I'm speaking from my previous role, when the property market was at an all-time low, and it was clear that was the only way we were going to be able to unload a site. Certainly that that avenue was used. However, I'll go back to the other site, which was we deemed it was a relatively high quality developable site. Ultimately that was not deemed to be the preferred route, and again we would take advice from the likes of LPS as to what the best way to unload a site would actually be.
Okay, it's just that unload the responsibility is a good approach, you know.
Yeah.
But sorry, Chair, did you ever lease them out to public or private body? Would you ever consider even a short-term lease that removed the responsibility for upkeep and insurance and liability onto the lessee?
I'm not sure a lease removes responsibility entirely. It'll help.
It does if you put it in the lease.
I think the principle we applied was that we as DFP at that time were not in the business of being private landlords. That our preferred option would always be to unload, to sell the building if we didn't need it, and use the capital elsewhere, if at all possible.
That's grand. But I've had the choice between holding on to something that was hard to sell, or allowing somebody to take a lease on it, and a foolproof lease, which made them responsible for upkeep and leading from that liability. I know which I would take. I'm not talking about a 50-year lease. But I don't seem to. It just seems rigid and ponderous, and it just takes too long. But
I think we've maybe strayed a wee bit off the monitoring round, but obviously, school estate and capital is clearly something which we will be returning to, and I know that you're coming up again on the 22nd of October. So we will return to that again. Can I thank you for your attendance this afternoon, and we'll be meeting in the next number of weeks again. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, members. Any other business?
Not any other business, but as a result of the question, it might be useful if we had some indication of what school estate is lying dormant, for how long it has been dormant, and indeed if an indication can be given on terms of what the breakdown of that budget is into the various categories.
That would be useful to have.
Sectors.
Sorry?
Various school sectors.
Well, I'm thinking, Chair, more in terms of the schools that are fully operational, the schools that are marked for closure, and indeed those schools which are already lying dormant and continue to need to have a maintenance budget associated with them.
Chair, as you're aware, the committee's lost its decision-making quorum, so what I'll do is I'll draft the letter, put it into matters arising for our next meeting.
Thank you very much.
So, the Minister said that if he had approval from this committee, he would intend to bring the accelerated passage proposal to the House next week.
There isn't. The committee doesn't give approval. He goes to the Assembly to ask for accelerated passage. That's in the first reading on the 6th. So all he's doing is consulting with us and just giving us the background to the bill. But we don't have the power to say yay or nay in this committee.
Through our parties,
Okay, so if can I just remind you again of tomorrow's event in the Long Gallery? It commences at 10:30 until 12:30, and the date and time for our next meeting is next Wednesday, then the 8th of October at 10 a.m. in this room. So if members are content, the committee is adjourned. Thank you.
Thanks, members.